You know, there comes a time in politics when more than just the politicians don't make any sense. And we live in such a time. And let me illustrate this with just a little test, a couple of questions. First of all, if government matters to you, if you think government plays an important role in our society and has a significant impact in your life, please stand up. Please stand up and then take a look around you. Look to your left, look to your right, look ahead of you and look behind you. Now, if you matter to government, if your voice is regularly being heard, if your concerns are consistently being considered, if your wishes are routinely reflected in our public policies, please remain standing. Otherwise, go ahead and sit down. Now look around again. Look around you again. You can see that you're not alone in feeling the way you feel and in the way you answer these questions. As a matter of fact, you are squarely in the mainstream because the UW Survey Center's latest polling showed that 2/3 of Wisconsin residents said public officials, and I quote, "don't care much about what people like me think." Over half, well over half, said that government is run by a few big interests and agree with the following statement: people like me don't have any say over what the government does. So think about what I just asked you. Does government matter to you, and do you matter to government? And think about how you answered, and think about when you stood, and think about when you sat back down. And is this the way that these questions ought to be answered in the greatest democracy on the face of the earth? There comes a time. There comes a time when the promise of democracy starts to look and sound like false advertising. And we live in such a time. When you and your neighbors and 2/3 of all Wisconsinites say that public officials don't care what people like you think, you've got perfectly good reason to feel that way. Our state legislators get $2 out of every $3 that they raise from people who can't vote for them because those donors don't live in their districts. Their campaign money comes from less than 1% of our state's population. You repeat that. Their campaign money comes from less than 1% of our state's population. They are not listening to you because they are paid not to listen to you. Now, we've all grown accustomed to hearing about $500 and $1,000 a plate fundraising dinners. What are they eating for that kind of money? Well, I just got a hold of a fundraising invitation for a luncheon in Milwaukee. $25,000 a plate. $25,000 a plate for a lunch. And ain't no doubt what they're eating. They're having all of us for lunch. There comes a time when politics gets so diseased and the politicians and the parties get so disconnected from the public that they're supposed to be serving that something's got to give. And we have unquestionably reached such a breaking point. One party is scary, the other's scared. The ranks of the politically homeless are greater than ever, and some have sought refuge in fake shelters, like the tea house that 3 of the richest men in America have built. There comes a time when history repeats itself so completely and so nakedly that certain truths become self-evident. Yet, mysteriously, an amazing number of people still are blind to those truths, and now is just such a time. People forget that the original Boston Tea Party was not only a protest of British rule, but it was also an act of civil disobedience against Britain's East India Trading Company. Those Tea Partiers understood how unrestrained corporate power goes hand in hand with political oppression. Today's Tea Partiers are most notably notable for blindness to irony. Their party is authorized and paid for by one of the largest privately held companies in the world, Koch Industries. And it's not Coca-Cola, folks. It's Koch Industries, K-O-C-H. Among America's billionaires, only Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are richer than David and Charles Koch. Their company and all of its subsidiaries operate in 60 countries around the world. They own oil refineries and they operate pipelines all across North America. They make Lycra for clothing and they make Teflon for pots and pans. They produce everything from Dixie cups to brawny paper towels. They do fertilizer and chemicals and plastics and commodities trading and cattle ranching and tea parties. Now, how rich are the Koch brothers? Let me put it like this. They are wealthier than Rupert Murdoch, whose holdings are said to be worth more than $60 billion. And I mention Murdoch because the Koch Industries Tea Party has been promoted 24/7 by Murdoch's media empire. Democracy is not possible without authentic journalism. And there comes a time when journalism fails us. And when some two-bit preacher with 50 followers is made a national celebrity because he threatens to burn another religion's holy book, you know we've reached such a time. And when Helen Thomas is no longer in the front row at White House press briefings, but a seat up front is given to a fake news organization that is dedicated to partisan propaganda and making us dumber and less able to see the truth and less capable of governing ourselves, you know such a time is upon us. There comes a time when words fail us. You know, George Orwell warned us about 1984, but I wonder if he realized that we might not stay warned until 2010. You know, plain English used to have a place even in politics. Time was a bribe was called a bribe. Then they started calling it a donation. Like giving blood or bringing a dish to pass after church. Now they call it free speech. There comes a time. There comes a time when our justice system fails us. Judges look at our Constitution and it says we the people, and they see corporation. Never mind, the word doesn't appear anywhere in the entire Constitution. Nowhere in the document can you find the word corporation. They see it anyway. And they look at the First Amendment, and it says freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and they see money. Words nowhere to be found. They see commerce. There is no commerce clause in the First Amendment, but they see it anyway. The First Amendment says the people have the right to assemble and petition their government and practice religion as they see fit, and they see a constitutional right to buy politicians. So then we win new rules here in Wisconsin to at least give us the ability to see who's behind the proverbial curtain pulling the levers, and 4 members of our state Supreme Court block those rules, keeping the public in the dark about who's paying for all that campaign advertising that we have to endure. The groups suing to stop the rules claim that even disclosure is a violation of their free speech rights. And the 4 justices summarily rule, and I quote, that the petitioners have met their burden to show a likelihood of irreparable injury. Injury? What campaign message is being banned by these rules? What ad can't be aired? What can't be said? The rules just require disclosure. There comes a time when equal protection under the law becomes a hell of a lot more equal for some than for others. And we have definitely reached such a time. Now it's obvious why the special interests that are buying politicians and want to own our government want to keep their activities a secret. You know, they don't want you to know whose pocket your elected representatives are in. And they don't want you to know that they get $100 back for every dollar that they donate. You heard me right. For every dollar they put into election campaigns, they get back $100 in tax breaks and in pork barrel spending projects and no bid contracts, sweetheart deals for state government work. Our research has shown when $50 million goes into state campaigns, $5 billion goes back to those donors. And we, of course, foot the bill for all of those favors that they get. And they would certainly like to keep those transactions out of sight. But now we've passed through the looking glass. And not only do these interests want to keep all this hush-hush, but we now have judges who are indentured servants of those interests. And they're handing down rulings effectively saying that keeping voters ignorant of this crooked game is required by the Constitution. There comes a time. The state Supreme Court justices who stood for this nonsense need to be named. And you need to know their names. The 4 state Supreme Court justices who stood for this nonsense were David Prosser, Annette Ziegler, Michael Gableman, and Patience Rogensack. Now, they are the same 4 who recently wrote new rules allowing Wisconsin judges to rule on cases even involving their biggest campaign supporters. Well, they didn't actually write the rules. They approved what 2 of the state's most powerful interest groups, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and Wisconsin Realtors Association, wrote for them. Boy, there comes a time. There comes a time when fighting Bob La Follette becomes more relevant, more important, more necessary than ever before in our lifetimes. And we gather at just such a moment. You know, if we are to remember fighting Bob properly, and if we are to celebrate his legacy in the way that it ought to be celebrated, we do it by acting as he would act. Our current circumstances would be all too familiar to him. Fighting Bob would recognize these times we live in. But he would not despair over our predicament. You know he would not despair over our predicament. You know that he would stand and fight. You know that he would howl in protest over the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in January in the Citizens United case allowing corporations to spend as much as they want on elections. You know that he would stand and he would have his voice heard, and we have to shout out our protest as well. But you know that fighting Bob also would insist that protests be turned into concrete action. Now, some say that we need far more robust disclosure laws to expose all of those engaged in the legalized extortion and bribery that is so rampant in our political system today. Others say that we need corporate accountability laws requiring businesses to notify and get permission from their shareholders before spending their money on election campaigns. And still others say we need a 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, spelling it out plain and simple for all of the judges in America that money is not speech, corporations are not people, elections are not auctions, and public offices are not commodities to be bought and sold. And we need to do all of these things. They're not mutually exclusive. They are all necessary. We need to do each and every one of those things. But as important as they are, as essential as these steps are, there is something else that's even more important, not to mention exceedingly difficult, that all of us need to do. We need to get way better at speaking truth to power. And let me tell you why I say that, because far too many times I've watched as so many of us go to public hearings or town hall meetings, and we are ready to give them a piece of our mind. We're ready to read them the riot act. And when our moment comes to speak, it's amazing how some of our choicest words seems to stick in our throat. We're overcome by politeness. You know, maybe you say enough to get under their skin, but then they stare you down and they tell you how offended they are that you would ever reach the conclusion that maybe a campaign contribution might have influenced them, because never, ever has a campaign donation ever influenced their decisions. And by the way, their biggest and most loyal supporter is that little old lady who lives down the street and used to be their third grade teacher. It's funny how every one of them seems to have the little old lady living down the street who used to teach them in third grade. And we listen to that, and almost apologetically, we pull our punches. And another opportunity is missed. And there comes a time. There comes a time when we have to stop being so damned polite. Remember how ostracized Fighting Bob La Follette was, particularly in the latest stages of his glorious career. Remember how he broke the unwritten rule in the United States Senate that freshman senators were not supposed to give floor speeches. He got up and he gave a speech that lasted several days and took up 148 pages of the congressional record. Remember how he read the roll call votes of his fellow senators name by name in his speeches. And here's what the New York Times observed. They said La Follette carried senatorial discourtesy so far that he has actually imperiled the re-election of some of the gentlemen serving with him in the Senate. Remember how hated he was by his opponents, and remember how his enemies eventually tried to kick him out of the Senate. And remember what he said. Remember Fighting Bob's words. America is not made, it is in the making. Mere passive citizenship is not enough. Men must be aggressive for what is right if government is to be saved from those who are aggressive for what is wrong. And if the men ain't willing to do it, the women sure ought to. Yes, we need better disclosure laws. Yes, we absolutely need shareholder consent laws. Yes, we positively and absolutely need public financing of elections. And yes, we can and we should amend the Constitution. It's been done 27 times before. It can be done again. But more than anything, we need to all get more comfortable being politically impolite. It seemed to come naturally to Fighting Bob La Follette, and we need to do as Fighting Bob did. And you know, there is one more thing that Fighting Bob would do. When the major political parties grow so rotten and corrupt, when there is no political party that can realistically be expected to govern in the public interest, you know that Fighting Bob would set out to create one that does. Now, maybe it's one of the existing parties that would be transformed, or maybe something anew would be created in our land, but you know that Fighting Bob would set out to create one that does. And I am not talking about a third-party movement. And neither would he. Neither would he. He would talk about a first-party movement, because there ought to be at least one party devoted to putting we the people first, to working for the common good, to governing truly and authentically in the public interest. Less than 1% of the population pays for today's election campaigns. There ought to damn well be a party for the other 99%. There comes a time when Fighting Bob starts to make all kinds of sense. And this is such a time. La Follette knew the kinds of challenges facing us today. He knew them really well because he lived through the Gilded Age. And he was successful in bringing an end to the worst excesses of that corrupt era. We are now living through a stilted age, where again a privileged few have been lifted up above the country's troubles, while the many struggle to keep their heads above water while they watch jobs and homes and savings and ways of life washed away. We are living through a stilted age. This is not the first time our state and our country have faced such perils. And what the Supreme Court did this past January is not the first time that Supreme Court justices have taken leave of their senses. Over 150 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that people can be property. 8 months ago, the Supreme Court ruled that property can be a person. It is same song, second verse. It is just as stupid, it is just as illogical as what the Supreme Court did a century and a half ago, and there comes a time when justice needs to be restored, and that time is now. Our nation's founders never said money is speech. They never said corporations are people. There comes a time when the actual words of the founders must be respected and honored, and that time is upon us. There comes a time when the will of the people shall be the law of the land. That was Fighting Bob La Follette's greatest hope. Those were the words that were his guiding inspiration. He shouted that hope to the heavens, and then he went to work and he took that hope and he made it history. And never before in our lifetimes has it been more important that we shout that same hope to the heavens, and at no time has it been more essential that we go to work and we repeat that history. The will of the people, the will of living, breathing, flesh and blood citizens shall be the law of this land. There comes a time. By God, there comes a time. Thank you. Thank you.